The city was buzzing like it always did on a hot summer afternoon. People rushed across sidewalks, the sound of car horns blended with the chatter of crowds, and the sun painted everything in a haze of gold. It seemed like an ordinary day. Nobody knew that within minutes the scene would turn into a confrontation people would never forget, a moment that exposed the ugly truth of prejudice but also revealed the courage of one woman who refused to be broken. Sometimes stories don't begin in quiet, predictable ways. Sometimes they explode right in the middle of real life, when someone makes a choice they can never take back. That's exactly what happened here. A man in uniform, a police officer, let his anger and his assumptions control him. And standing across from him was a woman who looked ordinary to strangers but carried a badge with more authority than he could ever imagine. But before we get to that moment, the punch, the shock, the fight back, we need to step into the world where it all began, because this isn't just about a clash between a cop and a woman. It's about something bigger: respect, power, justice, and what happens when someone is underestimated simply because of the color of their skin or the fact that she was a woman. Her name was Jordan. To her friends, she was just Jordan, the kind of person you could call at 2 a.m. if you were in trouble, the one who'd always listen when life felt too heavy. But at work, she carried a very different identity. She was Special Agent Jordan Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, calm, sharp, trained to handle high-pressure situations that most people would never even want to imagine. She had earned her place through years of dedication, grueling physical training, and a mind that never stopped analyzing details. And yet, outside the walls of her agency, outside the safety of her colleagues who knew who she was, Jordan often carried another weight, the kind that came from walking into a world that still judged her before she even opened her mouth. People saw her skin before they saw her skills. They saw her gender before they saw her strength. She was used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. On this particular day, Jordan wasn't wearing her FBI jacket or flashing her badge. She wasn't in a bulletproof vest or part of a big raid. She was just herself, dressed casually, blending into the crowd like anyone else. She had come downtown to grab a coffee and clear her mind after an exhausting week. But fate has a strange way of placing us in the middle of storms we never asked for. Just a few streets away, a police officer named Carter was patrolling the area. He was known around the department for being aggressive, quick to temper, and someone who carried himself with a sense of superiority that made people uneasy. Some colleagues ignored it, others whispered about it, but on the streets, civilians felt it in the sharpness of his tone and the way he looked at them like they didn't belong. Carter's path and Jordan's path were about to cross in a way that neither of them would ever forget. It started small, a misunderstanding, a look, a word, but small things can spark wildfires, and within minutes, the air would shift from calm to chaos. Carter, fueled by his own prejudice and arrogance, would make a move that he thought would put him in control. What he didn't realize was that Jordan was not someone who could be intimidated, not someone who would stand quietly while being disrespected, and certainly not someone who would crumble under pressure. The city square was alive with people, kids running around, a vendor selling hot dogs, a man playing guitar on the corner, his case open for spare change. Jordan sipped her coffee, scanning the crowd, her natural habit of observation kicking in. She noticed details others ignored. The way a couple argued quietly by the fountain, the man in a suit checking his watch every few seconds, the teenager nervously pacing by the bus stop. Years of training had made her mind sharp, always alert. Then she noticed him, Carter. The officer's presence was hard to miss. His uniform was crisp, his posture stiff, but it wasn't authority that drew attention to him. It was the way he moved, like he was hunting for a reason to assert control. His eyes darted around the square, narrowing whenever they landed on certain people. Jordan had seen men like him before. She could feel the energy he carried, the kind that wasn't about keeping peace but about showing power. She shook her head, trying to turn her attention back to her coffee, but fate wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. Carter's gaze locked on her. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident, calm, unbothered. Maybe it was her skin. Maybe it was simply bad luck. But in that instant, his expression shifted, and Jordan knew trouble was coming. He walked toward her, boots heavy on the pavement. People glanced but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Jordan didn't move. She wasn't doing anything wrong, and she wasn't the type to shrink away just because someone wanted her to. The first words out of his mouth were sharp, demanding, laced with an authority that came not from respect, but from ego. Jordan answered politely, her voice steady, but Carter didn't like that. He didn't like that she wasn't intimidated, that she met his stare without flinching. The tension grew thicker with each passing second. Onlookers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was about to happen. Jordan's heartbeat stayed steady. She had been in worse situations before, but she also knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person watching, about every kid in the square who might learn from this moment what justice looks like, or what it doesn't. And then, in a flash of anger, Carter made a choice that crossed the line from authority into aggression. His fist moved before his mind did, and the square gasped as time seemed to freeze. But here's the thing about Jordan. She wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just a woman grabbing coffee on a hot afternoon. She wasn't just someone who could be pushed around without consequence. What happened next would leave everyone in shock. The crowd would talk about it for days. The department would scramble to control the story. And Carter himself would be left questioning everything he thought he knew about power and control, because Jordan didn't just take the hit. She fought back, and in that moment the balance of power shifted in a way that nobody, especially Carter, saw coming. The sound of that punch lingered in the square like an echo nobody could escape. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of disbelief passing over strangers who had only seconds earlier been lost in their own ordinary lives. The music stopped. The kids who had been laughing at the fountain went silent, their eyes wide as they clung to their parents' legs. Even the traffic seemed to pause, the usual city noise drowned by the sharp, cutting moment of violence that shouldn't have happened. Jordan stood there, steadying herself. She wasn't broken, not even close, but her mind was running fast. Not because she was afraid of him. She had faced worse threats in undercover missions and dangerous investigations. What troubled her wasn't the punch itself, it was the truth behind it. This wasn't about law enforcement. It wasn't about protecting anyone. This was prejudice wrapped in a uniform, and yet no one around her knew who she was. To them, she was just another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, a stranger who had suddenly been turned into the target of authority. They didn't know she carried the weight of 3 letters that changed everything: FBI. Jordan didn't flash her badge immediately. She never did unless it was necessary. Part of her training, part of her discipline, was patience. Waiting until the right moment, but deep inside, she felt the burn of injustice. She wanted to ask him why her, why this, but she already knew the answer. Carter, on the other hand, wasn't thinking that far ahead. He was riding the adrenaline of control. He had spent years on the force, years believing his badge gave him the right to push, to intimidate, to make quick judgments. But this time, he had no idea what kind of storm he had stepped into. The crowd stayed frozen, caught between fear and curiosity. Some pulled out phones, raising them hesitantly, unsure if recording would make them a target too. Others just stared, hoping it would end quickly, and Jordan, calm, composed, though her chest tightened with quiet rage, took a single breath. But instead of reacting the way Carter expected, she simply stood taller. Her eyes never left his. It was the kind of look that told him she wasn't going to be just another person backing away from his authority. And that unsettled him more than anything else. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you'd have to know who Jordan was long before she wore that FBI badge. She grew up in a neighborhood where strength wasn't an option. It was survival. Her mother worked 2 jobs, often coming home exhausted but still finding time to sit with her kids and remind them of who they were. Her father had served in the military, and though his discipline sometimes felt like pressure, it built in her a resilience she carried for life. From a young age, Jordan had faced questions of identity. Teachers doubted her, classmates underestimated her. People in stores followed her with suspicious eyes, as if she didn't belong in certain spaces. But instead of letting those experiences weigh her down, she used them as fuel. Every doubt became motivation. Every wall became something she was determined to climb. When she told her high school counselor she wanted to work for the FBI one day, the woman had laughed softly, not unkindly, but with that kind of disbelief that said, "That's not for people like you." But Jordan didn't let that stop her. Years later, after countless hours of training, sacrifices, and failures she turned into lessons, she stood tall at her graduation from Quantico. That moment wasn't just a personal victory, it was proof that every barrier could be broken. Yet no matter how high she climbed, she couldn't escape the small daily reminders of bias, walking into meetings where she was the only black woman in the room, being spoken over when she had better solutions. Hearing whispers of doubt about whether she belonged in elite task forces. Jordan knew prejudice didn't vanish just because you wore a badge. Sometimes it only became more subtle, hidden in plain sight. And now, here she was, standing in a city square, confronted by an officer who had no idea he was picking a fight with someone trained to see through every lie, every false display of power. Carter's own story was different. He had grown up in a small town where his father had been on the force before him. To him, the uniform wasn't just a job, it was identity, family pride, legacy. But over time, his sense of duty blurred with something darker. Instead of protecting, he enjoyed controlling. Instead of listening, he silenced. His anger became his tool, his prejudice his excuse. He wasn't always this way, but years of unchecked power had turned him into someone dangerous. As he stood there, facing Jordan, he expected fear. That was the usual outcome. A raised voice, a shove, a step back. But instead, she didn't move. That silence, that calm, was louder than any words she could have spoken. It rattled him. The people watching didn't know the full story. They didn't know the weight of what was happening. To them, it looked like a clash of authority and a civilian who refused to comply. But beneath the surface, it was something far more dangerous. It was a mirror of everything wrong with power when it goes unchecked. Jordan's thoughts flickered to her training. In Quantico, they had drilled it into her. Stay composed, control the situation, never let emotions lead. But even now, even as she reminded herself of that, she felt something boiling inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every eye in that square was watching, and how she handled this moment could either break them or give them something to believe in. Still, she knew she couldn't show her badge yet, not because she doubted who she was, but because timing mattered. If she revealed it too early, the moment would collapse into shock and apology. She wanted the truth to be seen first, the raw, undeniable reality of what Carter had done. The officer shifted, uneasy. He could feel the crowd watching him too, their judgment heavy. A whisper of doubt crossed his mind, but he pushed it away. He had always doubled down, always found ways to justify his actions. But Jordan, without saying a word, was unraveling his control. The seconds stretched like hours, the silence between them louder than any argument, and in that silence, the crowd grew restless. Phones rose higher. Murmurs passed through strangers. People wanted to know what would happen next, but nobody dared to step in. Jordan's jaw tightened. She thought of her younger brother, who once told her he didn't trust the police because of the way he'd been treated as a teenager walking home from practice. She thought of the young girls who might one day face the same doubt she had faced, being told certain dreams weren't for them, and she thought of the badge in her pocket, the weight of responsibility it carried. This wasn't about her anymore, it was about something much bigger, but Carter still didn't know who he was standing against, and as the tension in that square grew heavier, as the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the story was only just beginning. What Jordan would do next would not only decide how that moment ended, but it would ripple far beyond the city square, shaking the foundations of the department, the media, and even the communities that had long felt silence. Because one truth was about to surface: when power collides with courage, the outcome is never simple. And in this clash between a prejudiced officer and an FBI agent who had built her life on strength, the fight was far from over. The world was watching, even if it didn't know it yet. The air in the square felt heavier by the second, like everyone standing there was breathing the same uneasy silence. Carter shifted his weight, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on Jordan as if daring her to flinch. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her expression calm, her gaze unshaken. That calmness was what unsettled him most. It wasn't resistance in the loud, obvious sense. It was resistance in its quiet strength. And quiet strength had a way of rattling people who thrived on control. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Phones were pointed directly at them now, the little red lights blinking, capturing every second. In another time, maybe this moment would have passed unseen, buried by excuses and reports. But now, people were watching, documenting. Jordan knew it, and Carter knew it too. And that knowledge made the tension unbearable. Inside, Jordan's thoughts raced back to her years at the bureau. She remembered the endless drills where instructors pushed her to the edge of exhaustion, not just physically but mentally. They had told her again and again, "You don't control the environment, you control yourself." That lesson had stayed with her, but it had also cost her. There were times when she had walked away from situations where she wanted to scream, wanted to demand respect, and yet here, in this public square, with strangers' eyes on her, she felt a shift. She wasn't just carrying herself anymore. She was carrying something bigger, the weight of every story like hers that had gone untold. Carter, meanwhile, was drowning in a different kind of storm. His pulse hammered in his ears, his pride demanding that he assert himself further. He had always believed his uniform gave him authority beyond question. Yet, with every second Jordan refused to bow to his posture, his authority slipped like sand through his fingers. His chest burned with anger, but beneath that anger was something he hated to admit: fear. Not fear of her, not yet. Fear of losing control. From the edge of the crowd, a man in a business suit whispered to his friend, "What's she doing? Why isn't she backing off?" Another voice, a woman holding her daughter's hand, said quietly, "She's not doing anything wrong. Why won't he leave her alone?" These small conversations, scattered and hushed, were threads weaving into something larger. People weren't just watching, they were taking sides, even if only in their minds. Jordan caught the whispers. She always did. Her training had sharpened her awareness, but her humanity made her feel their weight. She wanted to tell them she was fine, that she knew how to handle this, but speaking now would give Carter another reason to twist the situation. She chose silence, letting her stance speak louder than words. Her mind flickered briefly to her last case at the bureau, a drug operation that had stretched across state lines. She had gone undercover, blending into circles that would have eaten her alive if she'd slipped even once. She remembered the fear in the eyes of a teenage boy she had pulled out of that mess, a boy who told her later, "You're the first person who believed me." That memory anchored her now. Every action she took mattered, not just for herself but for the people watching, for the impression it would leave behind. Carter's radio crackled on his shoulder, a dispatcher's voice breaking through the tension. He ignored it. His world had shrunk to just the two of them, him and Jordan. He clenched his fists, struggling with the urge to act again, but hesitating this time. Something about her stillness unnerved him. He didn't know why, but deep down, he sensed this wasn't going to play out like all the other encounters he had forced into submission. The crowd grew braver, phones tilting higher, a few voices even calling out now. "Leave her alone," one man shouted from near the fountain. Carter's head snapped toward him, his glare silencing the man instantly, but the damage was done. The silence was broken, the tension cracked open wider. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were participating, however faintly. Jordan caught that too. She felt the shift, the way courage was contagious in small doses. But she also knew how fragile it was. If she moved wrong, if Carter lashed out again, the crowd's courage could vanish just as quickly. She couldn't let this turn into chaos, not yet, and then came a thought she hadn't expected. What if this isn't random? Her instincts, sharpened from years of investigations, whispered that this might not just be about Carter's prejudice or his need for control. Something about the timing, the way he had singled her out, felt deliberate. She replayed the last few days in her head. Her current assignment had been sensitive, too sensitive. She had been working quietly on a case involving corruption, a network that extended into unexpected places. She hadn't told anyone outside her team, but what if word had leaked? What if Carter wasn't just acting on impulse, but was being used as a tool to intimidate her? The possibility chilled her, but she kept her face unreadable. From another angle, a young man recording muttered under his breath, "This is gonna blow up online." His friend nodded, whispering back, "Yeah, but will anyone actually do anything about it?" Their doubt was sharp, cutting through the air, but Jordan pushed it aside. She couldn't think about social media or headlines right now. She had to stay locked in the moment. Carter's eyes flickered toward the phones, and for the first time, doubt crept into his expression. He couldn't erase what he had already done, the punch, but he could still try to rewrite the ending. He considered his options. He could step back, pretend it was a misunderstanding, call for backup, and drown the scene in procedure. Or he could keep pressing, keep forcing the narrative that she was resisting. His pride leaned toward the latter, but the presence of those phones complicated everything. Jordan saw the flicker of doubt and recognized it. She had seen it before in interrogations, in the eyes of people who thought they had all the power until they realized the ground was shifting beneath them. That recognition gave her strength. Still, the bigger conflict was just beginning. This wasn't about a single punch in a single square. It was about what it represented. To Carter, it was about his authority being challenged. To Jordan, it was about justice being twisted in plain sight. And to the crowd, it was about choosing whether to stay silent or to step forward. The subplots were already weaving themselves around this central clash. The young woman with her daughter wondered how she would explain this scene later when her child asked questions. The businessman with his phone wondered if recording this might risk his own safety. The teenager at the bus stop thought of his older brother, who had faced the same kind of treatment just a year ago. Every bystander was carrying their own angle, their own stake in this moment, even if they didn't know it yet. And then there was the shadow of Jordan's current case. The corruption she was investigating had roots deeper than she had first realized. She had already suspected someone inside law enforcement was connected. What if Carter was more than just a prejudiced cop with a temper? What if his actions today were tied to something much larger? Her chest tightened at the thought, but she forced her body to stay relaxed. She couldn't afford to let him see her suspicion. The conflict in the square wasn't just physical anymore. It was psychological, emotional, layered with history and possibility. Every second stretched the tension further, like a rope pulled tight, threatening to snap at any moment, and no one, not Jordan, not Carter, not the crowd, knew exactly how it would end, but everyone could feel one thing: it was far from over. The crowd felt restless now, as if the entire square had become a stage where something larger than life was unfolding. People shifted, whispering to each other, but no one looked away. Every pair of eyes was locked on Jordan and Carter, waiting for the next move. Even the city noise seemed quieter, like the world itself was pausing to see what would happen. Jordan's heartbeat stayed steady, but inside she was calculating. Every second mattered. Every look, every breath, every twitch of Carter's jaw told her something. He was unraveling. The punch had been his attempt to assert control, but when she hadn't broken, when she hadn't reacted the way he expected, the balance of power had shifted, and he felt it, but that didn't make him weaker. It made him dangerous. Carter's fists clenched again, his knuckles pale. He wanted to lash out, but the red recording lights from the crowd's phones pinned him down. His mind raced for another way to assert himself, another way to remind everyone, especially Jordan, that he was the one in charge. He barked orders at her, sharp, commanding, the kind of tone that demanded submission, but Jordan didn't move. Her stillness wasn't just defiance. It was a mirror reflecting back all the doubt and anger in him. The tension thickened, pressing on everyone's chest. Children tugged at their parents, whispering, asking why the officer was yelling. Some parents pulled them closer, not wanting them to see, while others stayed rooted, torn between fear and the sense that this was something history would remember. Jordan's mind drifted for a second, not away from the scene, but deeper into it. She thought of her fellow agents, the ones who had told her over late night coffees that their biggest enemy wasn't always criminals. It was silence. The silence that followed when injustice happened right in front of people and no one spoke up. She thought of her brother again, how he had once told her, sometimes it feels like the uniform decides who has power, not the truth. And here she was, living proof of his words, but she also knew something Carter didn't. She wasn't here just as herself. She was part of a larger fight, one that stretched beyond this square, beyond this moment. Her current investigation into corruption had already revealed cracks in the system, cracks that men like Carter thrived in. And now, standing in front of him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't chance, it was connected. Carter moved closer, his voice rising, accusing her of resisting, of disobeying. His words carried the weight of official authority, but his tone was laced with something bitter, something personal. The crowd bristled. A man shouted, "She's not resisting," and a few others echoed him. Carter's head snapped toward them, his eyes flashing, but the voices didn't die this time. They grew. Murmurs turned to words, words to protests. The crowd was shifting. Jordan saw it too. The people weren't just watching anymore. They were becoming part of the moment. And that changed everything. If Carter made another move, it wouldn't just be between him and her. It would be between him and the people. The thought tightened the air even further. The suspense reached its peak when Carter's hand moved toward his holster. The motion was slow, deliberate, but unmistakable. A collective gasp swept through the square, sharp and unified. Phones rose higher, capturing every angle. Parents pulled children behind them. Some people even stepped forward, torn between fear and the need to stop what felt inevitable. Jordan's eyes locked on his hand. Her training screamed at her to act, to disarm, to control the threat. But she held herself back by a thread, knowing one wrong move could ignite the entire scene. Her breathing slowed, her muscles coiled, ready. The world around her blurred until all she could see was Carter's hand inching toward his weapon and the reflection of her own calm face in his rage-filled eyes. The climax was building, every heartbeat like a drumbeat in the silence. Carter's pride and anger pushed him forward, while Jordan's patience and discipline held her steady. The crowd's energy surged like a wave about to break. The entire square felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something irreversible. And then Carter spoke again, louder this time, his voice echoing off the buildings. His words were harsh, meant to dominate, meant to turn the crowd against her, but instead of silencing them, his voice only fueled their unease. Whispers grew into protests. Protest turned into a chant. People were no longer just witnesses. They were demanding answers. Jordan's chest tightened, but not with fear, with clarity. She could feel it. The moment before the storm, the razor's edge where everything hangs in the balance. One wrong choice could end careers, lives, and trust. One right choice could change the narrative forever. The suspense was unbearable now. Carter's hand hovered close to his weapon, his face flushed with rage and desperation. Jordan stood unflinching, every muscle prepared, every sense heightened. The crowd pressed in, louder, bolder, refusing to fade into silence. This was it. The moment where power, prejudice, and justice collided in a way no one could look away from. And then the scene froze on the edge of the climax, with the world waiting to see who would make the next move. The square seemed frozen in time, everyone's attention locked on Carter's hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. Jordan could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, steady but strong, every instinct telling her to be ready for the worst. The crowd was louder now, voices blending together, some shouting for Carter to stop, others pleading for someone to intervene. The tension was already stretched to its limit, and then, just when it seemed like the moment was about to snap, something unexpected happened. A sharp voice cut through the air, clear and commanding. "Carter, stand down," heads turned. Out of the crowd stepped another officer, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. His name was Daniels, a lieutenant with years on the force. Unlike Carter, Daniels carried himself differently, calm, calculated, his authority rooted in control, not anger, but there was something in his expression that made Jordan's stomach tighten. He wasn't here to protect her. He wasn't here to hold Carter accountable. His presence meant something else entirely. The crowd quieted for a moment, relieved at the interruption, but Jordan's instincts screamed that the situation had only grown more complicated. Daniels didn't look surprised by what Carter was doing. If anything, his eyes carried a flicker of annoyance, as if Carter had acted too soon, drawn attention too quickly. Jordan's suspicions about her ongoing case came rushing back. She had been digging into corruption with links inside law enforcement. Was Daniels part of it? Was this confrontation with Carter just a spark from a much bigger fire? Daniels stepped closer, raising his hands in a gesture that looked like peace but felt more like control. "Let's all calm down here," he said smoothly, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We don't need anyone getting hurt." The words sounded reasonable, but Jordan knew better. It wasn't about calming things down. It was about steering the narrative. Daniels wanted to control the story that was unfolding in front of dozens of recording phones. She could see it in his eyes, calculation, not concern. Carter glanced at him, his jaw clenched, his pride wounded. He didn't like being told what to do, even by a superior, but Daniels gave him a look, sharp and unspoken, that froze him in place. It was the kind of look that carried consequences. The crowd began to murmur again, unsure of what was happening now. To them, it looked like another officer stepping in to de-escalate, but to Jordan, it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She wasn't just dealing with one aggressive cop anymore. She was staring at a system that seemed to protect itself, even in plain sight. Daniels turned his gaze on her, his smile tight, professional. "Ma'am," he said, his tone patronizing, "let's resolve this peacefully. Why don't you just show some identification so we can clear this up?" Jordan's hand twitched toward her badge, but she stopped herself. Timing was everything. If she revealed it now, Daniels would twist it. He would make it seem like the situation was nothing more than a misunderstanding, a civilian who hadn't identified herself. The story would be buried under paperwork, excuses, and silence. And Carter's actions, the punch, the threats, the aggression, would vanish in the shadows of procedure. She knew she couldn't let that happen. The crowd grew uneasy again. Someone shouted, "She didn't do anything." Another voice added, "Stop covering for him." The energy was shifting toward anger, the kind of anger that spread quickly. Phones weren't just recording now, they were live, streaming. People were watching this unfold beyond the square, across the city, maybe even across the country. Daniel seemed to notice too. His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his calm exterior. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Jordan could hear. "You need to walk away, Agent Mitchell." The words sent a chill through her. He knew who she was. He hadn't seen her badge, hadn't heard her say it. But he knew, and if he knew, that meant someone inside her case, someone she hadn't identified yet, had already marked her as a threat. Jordan's mind raced. She was no longer just dealing with Carter's prejudice. She was standing in the middle of something far deeper, something that reached into the very system she had sworn to serve. Daniels wasn't just another officer trying to keep the peace. He was part of the puzzle, part of the corruption she was chasing. The stakes had just risen higher than she ever imagined. Carter shifted beside him, still bristling with anger, still wanting to act, but now held back by Daniels' silent command. Jordan saw the conflict in his eyes, rage fighting against obedience. She also saw the opportunity. Carter's lack of control made him dangerous, but it also made him unpredictable. If Daniels represented the hidden system, Carter was the crack in it, the weak link that could be exposed, but the danger was immediate. The crowd was pressing in, the chants louder, the phones capturing every word. Jordan was surrounded not only by people but by choices, each one carrying consequences she couldn't yet see. Daniels's words echoed in her head, "Walk away, Agent Mitchell." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. The suspense twisted tighter. Jordan now stood at the center of a conflict with two fronts, an officer who had tried to break her with violence, and a superior who carried the quiet, suffocating weight of systemic corruption. The square was no longer just a scene of injustice. It was a battleground of truth and power, and the world was watching. Every second dragged the tension higher. Every breath felt like it might tip the balance. The question wasn't just whether Carter would act again, but how far Daniels was willing to go to keep the truth buried. And in that charged silence, with the crowd pressing closer and the officers closing in, Jordan knew one thing for certain: the fight was only just beginning. The silence before the storm held for only a few heartbeats, but it felt endless. Carter's hand hovered near his holster, his rage trembling under his skin, while Daniels's calm voice kept slicing through the tension like a blade. The crowd pressed tighter, their chants louder, their phones lifted higher, capturing every second that was about to define the moment. Jordan stood in the middle, her body still, her mind sharp, every muscle ready to act. Then Carter snapped. With a sudden motion, he lunged forward, his voice raised in a furious shout that drowned out the crowd. But Jordan was faster. Her training, years of drills and instincts honed to perfection, took over. In one swift movement, she disarmed him, her hand locking his wrist, twisting his momentum against him. The gun clattered to the ground, sliding across the pavement, and the crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. Carter stumbled, caught off guard by her precision, his face twisting with shock. He had expected resistance, maybe even fear, but not skill, not power, and certainly not the calm, unshaken strength in her eyes as she held him off with measured control. Daniel stepped forward instantly, his hand raised as if to intervene, but Jordan finally reached into her pocket. She pulled out her badge, holding it high for the crowd to see. The gold letters caught the sunlight, shining with authority that silenced the square in an instant. "I am Special Agent Jordan Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the stunned silence, "and this ends now." The crowd exploded, cheers, shouts, voices rising in disbelief and relief. Phones captured every angle as Carter froze, his anger collapsing into confusion and fear. Daniels's expression shifted too, but not to surprise. It was irritation, sharp and dangerous, like someone whose plan had been exposed too early. For a moment, the balance of power had flipped completely. The woman Carter had treated like a target now stood as the highest authority in the square. The badge was undeniable. The people had seen everything. And yet, Jordan knew the fight wasn't over. Daniels leaned in close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You think this changes anything? You've just made yourself a bigger problem." The words confirmed her suspicion. Daniels wasn't here by chance. He was part of the network she had been investigating, part of the corruption that stretched far deeper than one angry cop on a power trip. And now, by revealing herself, she had drawn a line in the sand. Carter struggled in her grip, his pride broken, his authority shattered in front of the world. Jordan released him, stepping back, not out of mercy but because she had made her point. His weapon remained on the ground, surrounded by the feet of onlookers who made no move to return it. The symbol of his power was gone, and everyone could see it. The climax of the confrontation was here. Truth against lies, courage against corruption. One woman's refusal to be silenced against the weight of a system built to protect itself. And for a moment, it looked like truth had won, but then the twist came. Daniels raised his radio, his voice calm, professional, rehearsed. "Officer in distress, possible armed suspect, immediate backup requested." The words cut through the noise like a blade. The crowd erupted in protest, shouting that it was a lie, that they had recorded everything, but Daniels's call was official, his tone steady. Within minutes, more sirens could already be heard in the distance. Reinforcements were coming, and they wouldn't know the truth. They would only hear Daniels's version of it. Jordan's chest tightened. She had won the battle in the square, but Daniels was playing a bigger game. He wasn't shaken by her badge because he knew he had the system on his side. Carter was humiliated, but Daniels was already rewriting the story, framing her as the aggressor before backup even arrived. The people shouted louder, lifting their phones, streaming, recording, vowing to show the truth. Jordan felt their energy, their belief, their outrage. For the first time, she wasn't standing alone. She had the crowd, the witnesses, the voices that refused to be silenced. The sirens grew louder, closing in. Carter stood pale and defeated, his authority gone, while Daniels's calm mask barely hid his anger. Jordan lifted her badge again, her voice steady but fierce. "Then let them come," she said. "Because the world is watching." The crowd roared, their voices echoing off the walls of the square, a tide of truth against the wave of corruption. And as the backup units sped closer, the scene stood at its razor's edge, justice on one side, power on the other, with the outcome hanging in the balance. The main conflict had reached its peak. The punch, the fight, the badge, the exposure, it had all led here. But Daniels's call had set a new fire burning, one that promised this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far larger. Jordan had fought back and won the moment, but the system was still coming for her. And as the sirens wailed louder, as the crowd chanted her name, as Daniels's eyes narrowed with quiet threats, the audience was left knowing one thing: this story was far from over. The sound of the sirens seemed to stretch time itself. Every second felt heavy, filled with the weight of what had just happened and what was about to come. The crowd pressed closer to Jordan, some holding their phones higher, others shouting for her to stand strong. Their voices mixed with the approaching wail of squad cars, creating a rhythm of urgency that echoed across the city square. Jordan's pulse raced, but her expression remained calm. She knew one thing: if she faltered now, everything she had fought for would crumble. Carter stood a few feet away, his pride shattered, his face pale. He glanced at the badge still shining in Jordan's hand, and the look in his eyes was no longer rage but fear. He had underestimated her, and now he realized the consequences of that mistake. But Daniels was different. His face showed no fear, no panic, only cold calculation. He had already set his plan in motion, and the backup cars racing toward the square were proof of it. He wasn't trying to win the crowd. He was trying to control the narrative beyond them. The first patrol cars screeched to a stop. doors flying open as uniformed officers poured out. Their hands rested near their holsters, eyes darting between the shouting crowd and Jordan at the center of it all. Daniels stepped forward quickly, waving them down, his voice firm and practiced. "That's the suspect. She attacked Officer Carter. Proceed with caution." But before the officers could act, the crowd erupted. Dozens of voices shouted at once, "She's FBI. We saw everything. It's on video." Phones waved in the air like flags of truth, cameras rolling live to thousands online. The officers hesitated, their eyes flickering to Jordan, then to her badge, then back to Daniels. Jordan knew hesitation was her only chance. She raised her badge high again, her voice calm but commanding. "Special Agent Jordan Mitchell, FBI, everything that just happened has been recorded. If you take one step toward me, you will be interfering with a federal investigation." The square fell into a tense silence. The young officer at the front of the group, barely out of training by the look of him, swallowed hard. His eyes shifted between Daniels and Jordan, clearly torn. Daniels glared, his jaw tight, but he couldn't override the power of the badge. Not in front of hundreds of witnesses and cameras. The stalemate dragged for what felt like forever until one of the older officers finally stepped forward. His voice was steady, professional. "We'll need to verify everything." He gestured toward Jordan respectfully. "Agent Mitchell, if you'll come with us, we can sort this out at the precinct." Jordan saw the trap instantly. If she left with them quietly, Daniels would twist the story behind closed doors. The videos could take hours, maybe days, to spread widely enough to counter his version. She needed to hold ground here, in the open, where the truth was undeniable. She shook her head slowly. "No, the investigation is already underway, and given the evidence present," she gestured to the crowd of witnesses with their cameras, "this square is safer for the truth than any closed room will ever be." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices now unified, chanting her name. Daniels's calm mask cracked just slightly as he realized he was losing the grip he thought he had. Carter shrank further back, avoiding eye contact with anyone, his once loud voice silenced. The senior officer hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, we'll hold position." His choice shifted the tide completely. The backup officers lowered their guard, choosing neutrality instead of escalation. Daniel seethed but said nothing, his eyes promising Jordan that this wasn't over. Over the next hour, the square became a battlefield of words rather than fists. Journalists arrived, drawn by the live streams. Local leaders stepped in, demanding accountability. Jordan gave her statement clearly and firmly, every word chosen with care. She didn't paint herself as a victim, but as an officer of the law standing against misconduct. She repeated the same phrase more than once. "The truth belongs to the people." By nightfall, the story had already spread beyond the square. News outlets replayed the clips, headlines flashing across screens. FBI agent confronts police misconduct in public square. Social media exploded with support, clips of her standing tall against Daniels and Carter going viral within hours. The truth had broken free, too large to be contained by any single report or cover-up. But for Jordan, the fight wasn't about headlines or virality. It was about justice. She knew Carter would face internal review, his career likely over after what had been seen. Daniels, though, was another matter. He was too careful, too connected. Exposing him fully would take more than a public confrontation. It would take patience, evidence, and persistence. In the weeks that followed, Jordan worked quietly but relentlessly. With the public's attention now fixed on her case, doors that were once closed began to open. Witnesses came forward. Files appeared on her desk. Patterns of corruption began to take shape. Threads that led not only to Daniels but to a wider network of abuse of power. What had begun as one man's outburst in a city square was now unraveling into something far bigger. The crowd that day had changed the game. Their recordings became the foundation of accountability. Their voices had forced transparency. And Jordan knew that without them, she might have been silenced. Instead, she had allies, strangers who refused to look away, people who believed the truth mattered. As investigations deepened, Daniels tried every trick to discredit her. He leaked false reports, spread rumors, even attempted to frame her in subtle ways, but the difference now was that people were watching. Every move he made was under scrutiny, and every lie he tried to weave unraveled faster than before. Carter, meanwhile, disappeared from the spotlight, suspended pending investigation. His silence spoke louder than any words could. Once brash and arrogant, he now carried the weight of exposure, a reminder of what unchecked power could lead to. Months later, Jordan stood on the steps of the courthouse after giving testimony in a case that had grown far beyond that first confrontation. Reporters surrounded her, microphones thrust forward, but she kept her answers steady, never sensational, always focused on justice. She didn't claim victory for herself. She spoke of accountability, of the people's right to the truth, of the importance of courage in the face of intimidation. And when one young reporter asked her what the turning point had been, she paused, looking out at the crowd of cameras and curious faces. The turning point, she said softly, was when people decided not to stay silent, when they chose to stand with the truth instead of turning away. That was when justice had a chance. The words spread almost as fast as the original confrontation had. They became a kind of rallying cry, quoted and shared, reminding people of the power they carried in their voices, their cameras, their refusal to accept lies. Jordan never claimed to be a hero. She knew the work wasn't about her. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, every truth that had been buried, every moment where fear threatened to outweigh justice. But in standing her ground, she had shown what was possible when courage met corruption in the light of day. Her story didn't end in that city square nor in the courthouse. It lived on in conversations, in reforms that began to ripple through the system, in the belief that no one, no matter their badge, their title, or their power, was above accountability. And as she walked away from the courthouse steps that day, the sun dipping low in the sky, Jordan felt the weight of it all. She thought back to the moment Carter had raised his hand against her, the moment Daniels had tried to twist the truth, the moment the sirens had closed in. All of it had led here, to this place where the truth had not only survived but thrived. Her journey had been full of danger, conflict, and resistance, but it had also been full of resilience, unity, and hope. And though the fight for justice would always continue, she knew something powerful had changed. That silence had lost its grip and truth had found its voice. That was the real ending. Not the punch, not the badge, not even the viral headlines. The real ending was the reminder that courage matters, that truth matters, and that when people refuse to look away, justice can find a way forward. And with that, Jordan walked on, not as a victim, not as a lone fighter, but as part of something far greater, a story of resilience, courage, and the unstoppable force of truth.